Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome in Salesforce Epics Hour. My name is Amit, and today we are going to talk about Remediate or Start a New Org. And we have a great speaker from the Salesforce team, Alison Park. So let me hand over her for her introduction and the presentation.
Great, thank you so much. So yes, I'm Alison Park. I am a principal enterprise architect at Salesforce. And what that means is I work with our customers and our prospects in the pre-sales perspective to help them articulate what their business goals are, their business strategy, basically their business architecture, how the processes flow and things like that. And then turning that into where they are from a technical architecture perspective and putting it all together to really understand what's the roadmap to get to where they are today to where they want to be, obviously from a customer engagement and a Salesforce perspective, and absolutely rolling that all together with what that business value is going to be so that they have the metrics to know that they're continuing in that direction that they want to go to. So all of that said, one of the things that we as enterprise architects at Salesforce share with our customers is this org strategy, remediate what you have, meaning fix what you've got and clean it up, or to say, no, we're going to need to pick up what we have and move to a whole new org to get away from some things in our org that aren't working the way that we want. So I'm really excited to share this topic with you. It's one that I think is really helpful no matter where you are in your Salesforce journey, as far as whether you've got lots of tech debt, whether you're starting in a new org, regardless of where you are, just understanding the thought process that goes into evaluating your existing org can be really helpful. Ideally, to hopefully help you avoid getting into a situation where you are really looking at these two options as, what do I need to do? So let's go ahead and get into it. And I'm very happy to answer questions. I will try and keep an eye on the chat and feel free to, I think you can raise your hand in Zoom. So I will make sure we've got time for that. So as we are moving forward, I really want to talk a little bit about how organizations find themselves at this crossroads, if you will. If you really look at things, we have gotten to the point we're now a 25-year-old company at Salesforce. Lots of changes in those 25 years. So it is not unusual that customers have been with us for over 8 years and may have a legacy org that has a lot of, the scars of the various changes in the business model, because business models do not stay fixed. They are a very dynamic thing. And it's also a concern around technical debt, meaning that especially as organizations are starting up, many times they don't put governance in place. There are changes in who is touching the org, especially over that kind of time period, and can have created inadvertently technical debt, meaning applications are no longer relevant. We're not reviewing the apex and refactoring on a regular basis. We may have had consultants come in, things like that. Or even in the case of heavily customizing it. Hey, when we started out, Salesforce wasn't able to do this. We really customized our own application that does this. And now either Salesforce does it or we've don't have a need for it any longer. And we've got this very large application that just doesn't mesh with the direction that Salesforce has gone. And all this adds up usually to our users are really frustrated with their experience in Salesforce because all of this is kind of, if you will, in the way. So we start to say, okay, we are at that point in time where we need to figure out, are we going to fix what we have? Or do we say, no, let's throw it all out and start over? And it's not an easy decision, and it's not necessarily something we want to make a quick decision about. So I want to share with you some of the tools that we use and hopefully give you some insight into what other folks have done to really understand how to move forward if you find yourself in that position. To give a little bit more color on what that feels like when you are coming to that kind of a crossroads, we hear some of these quotes. One of the things that I hear very, very often is hitting governor limits on core objects. And if I had to bet, it would probably be on that opportunity object. Usually that's the one that gets over leveraged, if you will, in the process. So you start to hit those governor limits as a result. Also see it when you have mergers and acquisitions. I've seen it where folks have pulled in another org because they purchased a company that already had Salesforce, and now we want to put everybody into one org, and we don't have the time to do really the homework and the cleanup that we need to before we put them together. So we end up kind of weighing down these objects with potentially duplicate fields and things like that. So those governor limits, while they have grown over the years and you've got more space and to do what you need to, we still find folks that hit those limits. The user experience. So this, instead of enabling innovation and better experience for our users, Salesforce is being viewed as a legacy tool. That always hurts my heart to hear because I think of Salesforce as really a place that you can innovate and you can do, certainly as we're talking more about doing more with data and AI, you don't want to have users thinking of it as a legacy tool and something to be worked around. So, but that can happen, especially in overly customized environments. I'm again going to, since this is Apex Hours, touch on Apex. The quote of, "We don't even know what's in the code." Those Apex classes are 11 years old, pages hang trying to get to data. So if any of that rings true, one thing that I feel very passionately about is to review your Apex code on a regular basis and refactor it. You want to make sure that the API version is up to snuff, that things have been refactored because we get new advancements 3 times a year, and we're taking advantage of those. It also helps us not to have a situation where we have something that becomes a black box, which can happen if we kind of, set it and forget it kind of mentality with Apex. So when we find ourselves in that situation where it's just been too long, anybody who knows how this actually works is not not in part of the company anymore. That's a big concern, and it's something that we want to make sure we overcome. And then lastly, many times when we lean on partners, they may be proposing that we blow it all up and start fresh on Lightning. Yes, there still are people out there on Classic. So when you find yourselves in those situations where partners are telling you, hey, this is something that we're recommending, you really want to make sure you're a part of that conversation and you are evaluating as your organization whether or not that's the right move for you, because it is a huge investment to really focus on remediating or creating a new org for sure. So these are not minor decisions, and we definitely want you in the driver's seat on any of those. So this gives you just a little bit of a taste of what that sounds like. If any of this sounds familiar, you're certainly in the right place. So when we think about kind of weighing between these two areas, when we look on the Remediate side, we've got both pros and cons. So in the green, the pro of remediating is you have a single production org that you're working with. It's the one that's already in place. So you don't have to go someplace else or anything like that. And you have a lower initial investment because you're not doing things in parallel. As you're starting up a new org, you need to be thinking about that. So when you have a remediation approach, you don't have as much investment. You already have the tools in front of you. The problem with it is that there is a longer time to value. Remediate and going through that is a much slower process than potentially jumping over into a new org. And there's a higher risk because the change management means that you are working on a production org, meaning that users are doing business on it every day. And you need to be super respectful of that as you are making those changes. You don't want to disrupt what they're doing, even though you have good intentions of cleaning things up, but you need to be much more careful about how much change you introduce, and preparing the users for it, because again, you're going into your production environment. When we look at going to a new org, there is a shorter time to value in the sense that I can set up the new org and migrate folks over from the old org in a much shorter time, because I have that opportunity to have that lower risk of change management by setting up that new org and not operating on the thing that everybody's using every day. I get that new org set, and then I start to migrate the users over. So those are the pros to just jumping to a new org. However, you do need to maintain a separate environment. You need to set up that separate org and run in parallel for some period of time. And that higher initial investment of both licensing costs and the cost of picking up the things that you want to keep and migrating those over, picking up all the user information and security and all those kinds of things, that is going to be a lot more. And you got to continue to maintain your existing production environment as well. So we've got pros and cons on both sides. So how do we make this decision? So that really does bring us to a true crossroads of which way to go. Really boils down to two critical factors. One is looking at the business. Where is the business going? What are the strategic priorities of the business? Are we operating differently than we were in the way that Salesforce is currently set up? What's the lift so that we can get to the point where the Salesforce environment that we have is 100% supporting what we need from a business strategic perspective. And then how much technical debt do you have? You are going to need to get your arms around it to understand, how much is really that technical debt, and describing it for the business so that you're all making that decision together. So you really need to have a good handle on both of these things before you make any kind of changes. So one of the things that we have as a tool is some preset template for you to use. I have a Quip link here if you use Quip so that you can actually pull it up yourself. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, but I do want to go through the Google version of this, because I think that's another way to look at this. So if I can quickly pull it up for you, give me just one moment to pull that up. And I will make sure I've got that. So are you seeing the org considerations? Pop in the chat, yes or no.
Yep, we can see that.
Great, thank you. So the first thing is business considerations. I talked about those two areas, the business and your degree of technical debt. So business considerations is actually fairly short. You've got a little under 10 things to be thinking about. First and foremost of the age of the org, and really questions around the business model, so that you can put them here. I talk about this being a template because there may be other factors from a business perspective that you want to think about, that you would want to add to this. So this is truly a template. Make a copy for yourself and your organization, and put it in writing. What is the response? Not just have discussions around it. The nice thing about going through an exercise like this is that you are committing to documentation, what your thinking is and how you want to approach it, and having that as a reference, both into the future and for everyone to be able to get on the same page about what's happening, is going to be really helpful. And then as we get into other areas of considerations, we start thinking about what is our org health? Do we have things up to date? Certainly running things like a field trip or an optimizer report, all of the above. Any other tools that can help you assess where you're at, and that degree of technical debt is going to be extremely helpful. Getting into the detail on what that level of code customization is, how much do you have out there, how many classes, how many triggers, page layouts, workflows. Certainly now we think flow, any validation rules, process builders, you know, lots of things out there, and we want to get a handle on what we have. It's also an opportunity to point out anything that's particularly problematic. If you have, say, process builders or old things out there that you definitely know we need to really focus on, getting that down on a piece of paper and being able to manage it and inventory it is super critical. And then understanding where your objects and fields are as far as governor limits and things like that, understanding where you might be in the red. I love the optimizer report for this because a lot of this comes right out of that and makes it super easy for you. We also want to get into data quality. I think that is another area that we tend to kind of have stories about, but we don't actually sit down and start to understand, you know, what are we talking about as far as numbers of duplicates? And is there a process that we have to address that? Where are we at with data storage and file storage? Yes, you can always purchase more of those, but is there a place where you may be able to clean up? Capturing that and recognizing that is going to be super helpful. Looking at your account hierarchy and product hierarchy. Those kinds of things are also very helpful to understand. I see a lot of companies as they go through business model changes, those things get changed but may not get cleaned up. So understanding if you have any issues that need to be addressed there, also very helpful. I have lightning out here, and again, probably most of you are on lightning, and that's fantastic. But like I said, there still are those on classic, or at least have certain numbers of users on classic. Understanding why that is and what the plan is moving forward is going to be very helpful, and maybe another reason to be thinking to help you assess between Remediate and New Org. Security setup, certainly looking at how things are set up from role hierarchies, permission sets and groups. How easy is it to set up a user? How easy is it to pull down and inactivate a user and then clean up from what they had? Those kinds of things, and understanding those and articulating those are also going to be helpful. Another big one is integrations. And I see this a lot as a reason that folks get, excuse me, very nervous about changing is when you have a lot of integrations to set up, it can make it very difficult to move certainly to a new org or to start to clean up things, because sometimes, especially if you have point-to-point connections for integration, that can be very unwieldy. So getting your arms around your integrations and facing that head on. Don't be afraid on any of these to ask for help or start to understand, hey, I've got this inventory of things that I need to help in addressing. We don't have the skill sets internally. We need to go out. If you have them very clearly inventoried and carved out of what you want to address, that can make it a lot easier to get partners involved and to help you to make that transition. And that will also help you speed up either remediating it or understanding what you need to set up in the new org. Very specifically on governor limits, API calls, that connecting to your integrations. You know, am I ever running into those limits and why? And any kind of those delays or things that you see in pages loading or hanging up, or users complaining about that, definitely want to inventory that as well. App Exchange packages are one that is can be particularly challenging, especially if it's an App Exchange that you no longer use. Getting that uninstalled sometimes is very difficult, or at least getting it in a situation where it's contained can be problematic. So definitely reviewing those App Exchange packages. I've been in orgs where there have been times where folks download an App Exchange package in production, and now you're kind of stuck with it, or it hasn't been uninstalled, or it's only used for one particular use case or something like that. Really getting your arms around App Exchange packages is another place that will be able to help you alleviate tech debt, or at least understand the level of tech debt. And sometimes can be, especially if you have a very large managed package and that you're moving away from, be another reason that might push you toward a new org, because that might be the easiest way to set up these functionalities. Governance and release management. It's one note here as far as assessing what you are as far as governance and release management. When I've given this talk before, a lot of folks have asked, well, how can I make sure that I don't get in a situation where I have to make these kinds of decisions? Governance and release management are the way to do that. The more tightly governed, and not tightly governed in the sense of you want it to be bureaucratic or heavy or any of those kinds of things, or prevent you from being innovative, but having a tight control on what makes it into production and making sure that you're intentional about clearing your technical debt in your governance process is going to keep you from ever getting into this kind of situation. So I can't say enough about governance. I actually was talking to a customer that was looking at going through a merger, and they were merging a much smaller company and thinking to merge it into the larger org that they had. And that smaller organization did not have a lot of governance. I would actually guess that they probably didn't have any governance. And when I brought up the idea of putting governance processes in place, even in the interim before they moved to the larger one, there was very much a reaction of, oh my gosh, we don't have time for governance. You do have time for governance. It's the very best way to make sure that the right things are happening in the right way, and that you are continually taking care of tech debt. So that is definitely my public service announcement regarding governance. And then reports and dashboards is actually at the end of the list. That is in many ways sometimes the easiest place to start, and the lighter lift of assessing where you're at with those and having regular cleanup of those. Sometimes you have things out there that are no longer being used, or you don't know that they aren't being used, and being able to start to deprecate those. One technique that I see quite a bit is, as we've inventoried them and start to say, okay, this hasn't been run or something like that, is putting those into a folder where not everybody can get to them. And then if somebody says, hey, I really needed that report, I can easily pull it back, but have a time period on that. More than 1 year, I actually recommend 18 months. The nice thing about an 18-month cycle on things, or reviewing things on an 18-month cycle, is usually if I have an annual report, I may only run it once a year. So if I'm just going at a year span, I may miss those things that just get used once a year, or think that they're not being used. If I look at more the span of 18 months, I can usually catch those as I am querying to look to when things were last run. Any questions on this template? Again, it is a template. You're going to want to add your own things. Just kind of looking out to the group that we have here live. Okay, great. I am going to flip back to our presentation. And go back into slideshow. So that was our template. Again, technical considerations definitely took up most of this conversation, even breaking it down into some of those org metrics and really kind of calling out where things are. Adoption is another one, really getting a handle on all of these. Absolutely use your optimization report, but start to gather a lot of these ideas and things and add them to your template. That will help make sure that you get these things into documentation. So usually what a framework, and certainly a framework that we use as enterprise architects when we work with organizations, is to take time to think about, okay, what do we want to do as we're at this crossroads, or we think we're at this crossroads between remediating what we have and going to something new. What are the things that we need to take into account? And what does this kind of a project look like? These are suggested timeframes. These are not carved in stone. For you, your results may vary, but you definitely want to be thinking, okay, I've got to do that research, all that inventory that we just went over, being able to fill that out. If something doesn't apply to you, you have 0 of whatever it is, that's great, write it down. Thinking about who you want on that team, understanding that if you do remediate versus new, you very likely are going to need to get support of the executives. So you want to have them, or at least a representative of them, at the table helping you make these decisions. So make sure to think about including leadership, and specifically business leadership, in this process. And if you have if it's mostly for sales or service or any area of the business, make sure they also have stakeholders in the room. Do that data gathering, the org health assessment, that questionnaire, having a map of your current state architecture. I will say that that's something, don't feel bad if you don't have that currently. A lot of organizations don't keep a current state architecture at a high level of, here's Salesforce, here's my ERP, here are the other applications I have around that, here's how they are integrated. Those kinds of things, even if it's at a high level, can be really helpful to understand, oh, I've got these integrations and this is how it all works. So if you don't have that, do take the time to at least, draw it out on a whiteboard, put it into Lucidchart or Miro, whatever your mapping software of choice is, so that you have a handle on that and update it regularly as things change. Really going through that workshop to get everybody on the same table, make sure that all the folks who are gathering data have a chance to understand what's happening, share that information, and then be able to present that information back to everyone. Some sample participants, you definitely want the folks that are involved with Salesforce, the lead admin, any of those business line leaders, as I mentioned, so that any business considerations are accounted for. And I would actually encourage you, at minimum, not everyone can have an enterprise architect. There's only a few of us, or necessarily their solution engineer, but definitely reach out to your AE and have your AE be a part of that conversation. There are many very good AEs, and they can help assess, especially as you're starting to consider what are the licensing implications if I go to a new org. They can get you those numbers so that you have those budgetary considerations and can be aware of where you're at. And then really taking the time to analyze all that data that you've brought in. Think about the considerations around business and technical, and how you as a team would recommend going after that. Definitely work together to draft that recommendations and review it together, so that you're pulling in leadership into this process, and then actually presenting those findings at a meeting so that you can get to the point where you're making that decision. Again, keeping all these folks in the loop. And it's pretty natural to think, hey, I want to make sure my Salesforce people are involved in this conversation, likely IT, but I think a lot of folks forget, or the business doesn't understand what their role is, and their role is pretty critical to this process. So again, this is just to give you a direction to kind of break it into terms of how you go about this. The time period may vary drastically depending on the size of your organization. So I want to share with you some sample orgs and kind of what ended up getting considered. So in this case, we have an org. This is our first sample. And they ended up going to a new org. They had an instance that was over 10 years old, which on our scale, we said that's in the red, because that automatically, anything over 8 years, we probably want to pull into the red. Their original vision had changed. So originally, their data model was that they were selling to end users and developers. They have shifted that, and they want to go to an account first way of selling to the organization and less focused on those particular roles. And then do they have a map of their business processes? And they said they do not. And are they working the lead conversion in particular, the way it is set up and was developed? It actually creates multiple accounts because the focus was on the individuals. Now they are obviously going to need to have that if account first way of looking at it. How's the adoption? People are logging on, meaning frequency, but not breadth of value, but they're not really focused on staying in there a long time. They kind of go in, get the information they need, and get out. So that is a concern. The data, there is low trust in the data. So the data quality is very poor, and it's not current. When we have bad data, the faith in the org is absolutely lost. So this is another point of really re-architecting what you have. The data model doesn't work. And when they looked at their org health, these were the statistics that broke down. So they were really worse than their peer groups. And sometimes an AE can help you understand kind of where you are compared to peers, so that you can assess. So everything is in the red, a couple things in the yellow, but nothing in the green or even bluest side of things. So this is why they decided to go to a new org. All of the pros and cons really pointed to it would be worth that initial investment and to really go to a new org so that we can really fix a lot of those things that we see. Completely clean up the data, change the way the interface works, and really change even the way the metadata works because our business model has shifted. Any questions on any of this? Great. So number 2 is where they decided to remediate the org. What's interesting about this is the age of the instance was 18 years, so almost twice as much as the previous one. And it has become more broadly used in the last 8 years. So it's not uncommon to find, yes, I may have had Salesforce for quite a period of time, but it really got into being generally used in the last, X number of years. The direction and growth of the business. They're really wanting to just expand what they do. So this is actually straying from yellow into blue because the direction and growth of the business is around growth and less around, hey, we've changed our selling model. And this shift to more cloud-based selling with the customer has really not changed the business model. The implemented processes are aligned to the way that they do things. Their org health are pretty good. They hadn't adopted Lightning yet, and there are a large number of duplicates, and the opportunity object, the one that usually causes the issues, is pretty close to the 500 custom field limit, but 60% of those are not being used. So that puts them in the yellow, not in the red necessarily, because, as we circle around that, there is a path to going from Classic to Lightning for sure. So they just need to continue on that path, and those are things that can be solved. And the adoption is actually good. It's probably a little low on mobile and certainly Lightning, but those are things that can be grown into and don't require jumping to a new org for sure. And there is a pretty good trust in the data, and that is, as we know, super important for people's faith in what the system is telling them. And the hierarchy is working fine for them. So the logical data model is good. So it's all the way in the blue. So when you look at this, if you just saw the instance of the age, you might say, oh, well, that's obvious. You need to go to a new org. But as you start to dig into the detail, you see that it's really at the core. It's working for them. There are opportunities to get rid of some technical debt, but it is not a massive undertaking, and it can be done. So therefore, they decided to remediate it. Leaning on staying in that single production org, that lower investment, it is going to take them a little bit potentially longer than if they jump to a new org, but I think that'll be very much well worth it. And ideally working in that continual addressing of technical debt will really bear fruit. And I have a couple more examples to share before I let you go. There is a presentation from Amazon about what they did as far as they took the new org approach and some of the things that they looked at when they did this. And at the very bottom of these slides, there is a link. It's from Dreamforce 2016. But it is publicly facing, so you can actually watch the presentation and get a lot of information and advice from folks who actually went through this process themselves. And really around their overall situation, just to summarize, they had an old implementation and it was looked at as what a growth inhibitor or really a legacy system. And it was really challenging them to move forward. So they felt that going to a new org would really give them that momentum to start thinking differently about what they saw and how they worked across things. And they thought in terms of an MVP, and they called it the Amazon MVP, but really that agile approach to setting up that new org and iteratively releasing those capabilities and leaning heavily on the culture of really setting up this new org with really this fresh outlook. So in their case, the rebuilding of the Salesforce instance was an 11-month project. I will caution you that it varies widely what that rebuilding process is and how long that takes. And it depends a great deal on the number of resources that you put into it. So that was the Amazon story. I highly recommend taking a listen if this any of this resonates for you. And then the other example that I wanted to share with you was Aon, which did the Remediate in place. So they also had a 10-year-old instance with 7,000 users, and they were really using it around the beginning campaign management, pipeline management, and proposal requests. Their challenges were a lot of configuration and functionality that wasn't helping them anymore. They had a hard time moving things from test into production. Things were breaking. They had governor limits that were being hit. And they probably had a lot when they talk about the code being overly complex and difficult to maintain. Certainly when you have an older org like that, we didn't have flow way back then. So moving it to a lot of more the clicks, not code types of area will, along with code, would allow them to remediate it and be able to maintain it more into the future. So they did need to form a global governance body to help them guide that and manage those changes. And this remediation process took them 18 months, which is actually pretty good, but they did get a fair number of resources working on that. So one nice thing was they had a before and after, and pretty much across the board, because they had done this inventory, once they remediate things, things were much lighter, cleaner, and lower numbers of all these things. So really rethinking those business rules and having a global governing body help them to make good decisions that will be a lot easier for them to maintain. And this is all I have. Are there any questions before I wrap up and throw it back to Amit? It's been a very quiet group. So I hope this was very helpful for you as you're going on that journey. I'm going to jump back really quick to the opening slide, which has my LinkedIn information on it. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn if you are interested in getting the slides or that template, and I'm more than happy to share that. So thank you for your time.